This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story.
Hey, we'd love to have a rating or review on iTunes. If you'd like to head over there and just leave whatever rating and review you'd like to, it would really help us keep the podcast going. Thanks so much.
Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are going to talk about fleshing out your descriptions in revision. Now, I understand there is some pain around this process right now. Would either of you like to start talking about the pain? Why is this difficult? What is your take on fleshing out description? Why can't we get it right in the first draft? What is hard about description? Yeah, come on, what's up with that?
For me, I definitely have spoken about this before, where my mind races when I'm drafting, playing the movie out, and it's not physically possible to even dictate that fast as to how fast the visual images are moving in your head. And so if we want to create visual descriptors, obviously there are others. There's auditory and sensation-based and emotion descriptors. But certainly in terms of the visual parts, they're the things I have to go back in and mostly insert, because I just don't have time while I'm frantically typing to include the detailed description of the extraordinarily rich painting that's on the ceiling of the chapel they just walked into or something. It's just that, chapel description here, if I have to be. And for the most part, I don't even think about it. I just forget it. And it's only when I go back into revising, I think, oh, okay, they've just walked into this place, but no one's got any idea what it's like.
Right.
Or it's, they stepped into the room. Well, do I need the reader to have a sense of what type of room that is? Does it matter? It may not matter. But if it does matter, because there's going to be, say, a fight sequence coming up, where we might need to know what objects are around, or how big the space is, or whether there's another exit point, or whether one of the characters is the type of person who would notice those things. And so it doesn't make sense for them to go into a room without noticing, whether is there somewhere to sit. Is there some kind of hierarchy of who does what in this room? So I think I definitely have a tendency to skip, because my drafts are definitely all about action and dialogue. So I know when I go, I've got to put it in. I don't find it particularly painful, but only painful in the sense that, oh, okay, here we go. I've got to write all these extra words and describe things I don't really want to, but because it exists in your head. And when I'm reading even second draft, sometimes I'll think, yeah, I can. That's in my head, and I haven't got it out there properly. And there can be a legal logic for that. So sometimes even adding a description allows the reader to follow the logic of action that you made in your head. So whether they've gone from suddenly they're fighting here, and then they're pulling the cannon around to try and train it on a warship. Well, how did that happen? Oh, they had to go through an airlock, or they had to jump in the water, or they had So sometimes it helps create that logical sequence as well. Because I write very, very to that visual track, it definitely is something I skip and have to go and add.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that. I find a lot of manuscripts I see are lacking in setting description, which becomes a problem not just for the logic issue you've pointed out, Robert, but as a reader, it can start leaving me feeling a real lack. I call it green screen writing. It's like when you see the actors in front of the green screen and nothing has been put in behind them yet. It's like, wait, your story's taking place in a vacuum. I don't have any touch points of this world to put these characters in. And initially, as a reader, I might not notice it because I'm focused on the characters, the dialogue, the action. But at some point, not too far into a scene, I start going, wait a minute, like, where am I? What's going on here? Yeah. Kathryn, is your description issue mostly with setting or other kinds?
I think that's a good question. I feel like it's multiple different kinds of description. I feel like I get going and then I get stuck on, I know that something feels a certain way or looks a certain way or, you know, whatever. And I just can't quite get there in the moment. Like, I just don't know how to say it. And then, so it's been bogging me down, as I've been trying to draft. And so I've been just putting a lot of little notes to myself on what kind of description I want in the scene and then moving on. And so I'm like kind of getting discouraged by how many notes I have of where I'm going to need to go back in and fill in description. So I was wondering, Robert, do you put placeholders in there or do you just not even notice that you're skipping the description in your first draft?
A bit of both. Yeah, a bit of both. If it becomes obvious to me that I'm going to need to put some arena that this is taking place in, then it's going to slow me down too much because my mind is really churning through. I need to get that down as to what's happening. Then I'll put a placeholder. But sometimes I don't notice it until I go back and see, you know, they I don't know, they, let me try and think of something. You know, they moved into the kitchen. And then all of a sudden, you know, they're preparing something and it just, something jolted, you know, I didn't. So it's only when I start, actually think about that, Kathryn, that's a good point. I will then go back and read, I print out and I also read on the Kindle so that I'm not editing or revising on a computer first up anyway, because I'll read through my first pass and then I'll make notes. I won't fix it then, but I'll make notes as to, you know, there was a big logical leap here and I didn't know where we were, or something, you know, flipped, and or you know, the description was weak, as in, you know, the car drove off quickly. Well, you know, I can show that much better than that, you know. So, you know, as in, you know, the smoking of rubber or, you know, smashing of gears or whatever it might be. So I think it's not always to do with setting. It's sometimes to do with verbal, use of verbs, because I think when you're drafting, what we think in our heads is sort of how we speak, and we speak in a much smaller vocabulary than we're capable of writing. So I think it does pay to go back and look at, well, I've put it this way, but, you know, did she just run, or did she sprint, or did she, you know, stumble and trip and have to leap a wall, and those sort of things that bring it to life. Right. So I'm aware that those are my tics. I tend to shorthand in my descriptions, not just in setting, but in verbs and actions, because I'm trying to get all this action and dialogue down. So I rarely have to go back and edit dialogue, because that seems to be the thing that plays in my head nicely. So I would call that a strength, but going back and making my descriptions richer or adding them where they've been absent are things that I know I have to do. So I will go looking for them, as well as having had placeholders from time to time, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I think it's just been an interesting draft for me, because I normally a couple of years ago, pre-child in my life, I would sit down for an hour and a half and, you know, I'd write 3,500 words and I just flow state, boom. Right. And so I could hit those descriptions, even if they were weak, or even if they weren't, you know, maybe as good as I needed them to be eventually, like they were there. You know, so there were words on the page. And now I'm getting the opportunity, you know, I'm like, oh man, I've got 3 minutes, sit down, journal really, really fast, right? So then I get stuck a lot more in the description area, because I don't really have that flow state going, and I don't really have myself like really that deep into the story. And so I feel like it's such a different experience for me to have all these placeholders and notes rather than words in the story, you know what I'm saying? So it's been an interesting transition.
Have you thought about when you just have a few minutes to sit down and think or write, have you thought about taking one of those placeholders and making that the writing? Oh, I have to describe the, you know, church or something, and just do that, and don't worry about the characters, the action, the dialogue. Just do that description piece.
That's a really good idea, because I feel like sometimes my world building takes kind of a back seat to just like what happens next, what happens next, what happens next. I'm just trying to kind of keep moving through the draft. So that's a really good idea, just to like put a bunch of those little placeholders on like the tops of pages so that I have a bunch of like prompts to just fill in description, fill in description, fill in description. That'd be really interesting experiment.
Yeah, and they would be great writing prompts too.
That's what I was thinking, because as you were talking, I said, okay, I can see how having time chopped up like that would cause me to have difficulty to access that visual flow state and feeling like I'm immersed. So one way to fix that would be to say, okay, well, the first 2 minutes of anything I do is going to be, I'm assuming you've got more than 2 minutes, is going to be describing that wall or piece of clothing or the car or the carriage or whatever it might be, because that's immediately going to get my mind immersed. So anything you can do to get your mind, that's a smart idea, Alida, I think.
Yeah, and it is, to some extent, it's throat clearing, right? Which we've talked about before, is like you need that moment to get back into the story. So if you use your throat clearing time as description time, like that could be really both.
It may not be wasted,
right?
As well as getting you back into that rhythm and that flow. So that's cool.
Yeah, and I think we should note that description, whether you're describing the setting or what the character is doing, or even the character's internal world, anything you describe is happening in your narrative voice. So whatever you're describing is helping to shape the fabric of the story for the reader and evoking mood, pace. I mean, all of those elements come through in your description. And so, description isn't just about world building. Right. It's got a much richer role in our stories. And it deserves attention because of that.
Right. Yeah. So then how do you, when you are going back in revision and kind of like weaving that description in, like how do you do that physically? Like, are you reading a couple pages ahead of time and then, behind and then trying to fit it in? Or are you just inserting and then trying to kind of mesh it? Like, how are you doing that?
It depends on the description I'm trying to put into the piece, so definitely start with reading not only the page or two that came before what you need to insert, but a section of your work that you're really happy with, so that you're hearing that voice and you're getting that voice playing through your head again, because the section right around what you're revising might not be, exactly what you're going for. So first get that voice in your head at the beginning of your writing session, and then look at that insertion point. And is the prose you're working with good enough that you can just pick up at the end of one sentence, add your description, make sure those transitions are good, and keep moving? Because if not, you might have to rewrite a scene, or you might have to rewrite a whole chapter, knowing, okay, this draft contains my kind of bulk material, but now I've got to do the refinement. Now I'm going to take all of the prose up to the level I want it at, and I'm going to make sure that description gets in there because I've had time to do the processing. I've had the time to decide what that needs to look like.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's the thing that really pees me off, is when I go back and go, okay, I've got to have something in here that grounds the characters as to where they are and what they're doing. But I've got these 3 pages of super snappy dialogue, and think it's just really good. And if I put it there, it just breaks up the flow. And if I put it there, so it's really. And so I think you're saying sometimes you do have to do a bit of a rewrite. One way I've got around that is just putting the block of what I think needs to be in there in some place where it's never going to stay. And then kind of saying, okay, which parts of that can I then tease out and sort of slide into maybe action beats or dialogue beats or a quick aside if it's a narrator that, narrative voice that allows for a quick aside, in some omniscient fashion. Or if it isn't, could it be that the character suddenly notices something? I hadn't seen that stain on the wall before. I don't know why it's bugging me now. Maybe I'm trying to tune out what Richard's saying to me. It's you could do it that way. So I'll write what I think needs to be in there and then look for ways to thread it through. But as I say, it really does pee me off sometimes when you think, oh no, this is going to totally destroy that brilliant piece of work I had there.
Yes.
Right.
Kill your darlings.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the fact is that if, I might read it and I know what's going on in the surroundings, but the fact is that a beta reader or an editor or the final reader is going to read that thing, and they're, as you say, Alida, they've been floating in space for three pages. I have no idea. Are they sitting? Are they standing? Are they drinking? Are they walking? What's happening? Are they still in bed? Did they get up? Because didn't they just wake up?
Yeah.
So those sort of things. If you leave them hanging too long, it's hard to stick with.
It is. And I think as writers, we need to keep the reader in mind. Maybe not in the first draft. It might be best for your process to just write and get the story down. Mm-hmm. But at some point in your drafting journey, you need to keep asking yourself, is what's in my head on the page, so that a reader will be watching the same movie I am? You know? Because if not, you're going to leave things out that are really, fantastic pieces of your story in your mind that you're probably jazzed about, but the reader not experiencing that.
Right, the disconnect.
Yeah, real disconnect. And it does a disservice to your story when you don't translate the richness of what's in your head onto the page for the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and also I think my advice there as well, because I think I did this in the early stages, is what I've been learning more recently, and I've talked about neurolinguistics before. We had this, there's a terminology I think it's in hypnotherapy, which is called artfully vague, where you make a suggestion that's a broad suggestion, but it's not so broad that people can't latch onto it. So, for example, let me try and think of something now about being artfully vague. So rather than just saying, you're feeling comfortable, you might be saying, notice the smoothness of the fabric against your skin, for example. So it's quite specific, but it's still vague. You're not saying notice the corduroy fabric against your rough skin, because some people are going to be thinking, but not wearing corduroy and I don't have rough skin. So you have to make it vague enough that it can be abstracted, but not so generally vague that people don't know what to do with it. So when you're writing, you're not going to say they entered a grand room. It's too vague to extrapolate, to find a reference in my mind. What do I mean by that? They entered the room. The ceilings had to have been at least 19 feet, but they were darkened by a rich oak or something, or an antique. So it's those little specifics that then allow the reader to build what's grand inside their head. And the danger is the two extremes. The danger is being too vague. So they entered a huge room. So I don't know what to do with that. Does it a room with furniture? Or is it, is it some kind of, I don't know, is it a place of worship? Who knows? Got no idea. Or too specific, as they entered the room, the massive oak doors with huge rusty hinges down either side were really hard to pull open. And the light, it just got too much. There's too much detail.
Right. Overdoing detail can become tedious for the reader, and then it messes up your pacing too. Right. Your story gets bogged down.
Exactly. But don't be scared of detail.
Right.
Because the little drips of detail are the things that make it rich, in my opinion. And if you can then bring that back to things the characters notice, it's even more wonderful, because it speaks to the character's personality, and then ultimately, if those things then get used in the story as well, then we've got the beauty of great prose, where the reason that they notice the gun above the mantelpiece is because in the third act the gun goes off. Those sort of things. Right.
Yeah, details and specificity are your best friend as a writer, but you have to find that happy balance of things. And one of the things you're getting at here, Robert, is that it needs to matter to the story in some way, either because it matters to the character, the perspective we're seeing this room through, or because it's something significant in the story, like the gun that's going to go off later, right? So as a writer, we get to spotlight what we show to the reader. So you might want to paint the whole of the room in somewhat broad strokes, but then you're going to give us those few telling details that really anchor us in some specificity, that are significant to the rest of the story or the world. And they might be significant in just the sense of creating mood. I mean, that's a valid reason. Everything doesn't have to play out later or have deep meaning to your character. So significance is a broad term, but an important one. So
then would there necessarily be an advantage to doing a lot of your description and revision then, because you've already kind of seen the whole arc and you know what's important and you know what sort of threads you want to draw up in each little place, like especially if you're doing a little bit more of a discovery draft or you don't necessarily know all of the details?
No. I mean, advantage, if we say there's an advantage to saving these things for revision, then it's like saying, oh, just take a pass on description. You don't need to describe it now. When you hit that flow state or you're in the right headspace and it's coming to you, you've got the movie playing and you're in the right state of mind to get that on the page, all those visuals and the elements, and it's working for you. That is the best. But sometimes, sometimes that doesn't happen and you have to come back and get it at revision, or sometimes it does happen, but in the next draft, you see that one really beautiful detail that you can add that just, blows up the scene, that just makes it gorgeous. So is there a benefit to it? Well, if it doesn't happen in the current draft, then yeah, there's a benefit.
Yeah, and also, I mean, we've probably talked about this in the past, and whilst there are some things we think might be fundamental to story, there's nothing really fundamental to a particular way of creating the story.
Right.
So, whatever works for you in the sense of if you know, I mean, some people really love descripting, have got to go back and make the dialogue snappy.
Right.
So I think it does depend on whatever you can do to get that first draft down fastest, in my opinion, is worthy. So if you feel like you're getting bogged down on descriptions, then don't. But if you feel like a description is getting you into the flow, by all means use it, and knowing that you might have to come back and temper it later because, there's been 3 pages of description between a question and an answer between characters.
Right. And, sometimes you can't advance the story without getting your description down, because setting is a key element in any story. So if you're writing a bar, a kitchen, whatever, you might not need to figure out all of the details right away. But if you're writing the castle where the seat of government is and everything takes place, you need a pretty solid grasp on that place and the mood it creates and how it affects your characters in order to get those scenes on the page.
Right.
I wrote a large chunk of my current manuscript placing Evelyn at the School for the Feeble-Minded in a cottage housing like 40 girls. And then I realized I needed to have her in the main building on the 3rd floor for a plot reason. So all of this lovely description I did around the cottage, I now have to go back and revise. It's not a big deal, but it would have been nice to know how this plot point was going to affect my setting before I wrote those scenes. And then I could have just described the 3rd floor dormitory from the get-go. Right. Our stories are shaped by our setting and vice versa.
Don't know if any of that's any help to you, though, Kathryn.
I think
I like the idea of the writing prompt at the start, though, to sort of, okay, I put in this placeholder for a description. Maybe I should just do that now because I've got a few minutes, and then to the flow of the story again.
Yeah. Well, and I've been finding my biggest problem is I've been finding that it's stopping me. Yes. Right. That I literally sit there and stare at the page like I know that I need a description here and I just can't see it. and it just doesn't exist right now. And so then I just kind of like have had to train myself to skip it. Mm-hmm. And so knowing a little bit more about how you guys go back and put it back in, or, trying some new things, I think is going to really help me to move on past it and not to let it bother me. Not to let pages sit blank for days while I hem and haw over how I'm going to get that description in there. So,
right. Well, and if you aren't seeing it, go back to your journal and just start scribbling. What does this place look like? What is the mood in this room? What sounds are outside the windows or in the hallway or whatever? Right. And I think you'll get the picture forming if you get away from the blank page.
Right, exactly. Because I think part of that also is the expectation that, okay, now I've got to put it in my point of view character's head, and what are they seeing and what's important. And so then you kind of get bogged down in like,
it affects so many things.
Right. Not only do I need to describe this, but I must describe it properly in order to move on. And so like you said, Alida, like moving away and just being like, okay, what does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? Now I can come back and say, now how does he perceive it in this moment? That's a really good idea.
And I don't think those things are necessarily that hard to change either. There are things that you would probably change anyway in revision just to strengthen your prose. So the fact that some things are going to change is a fact of life.
Right.
It's just a question of what angle you come in. And I think if I think about things that bog me down, it's usually accuracy. So I think, they're going to shoot somebody here, but how do they do that on a spaceship? Okay, then I'm off on the internet, and realistically, and what worries me is if I've made a significant decision that then influences plot later on, as Alida was mentioning. But you just got to live with that. That's the vagaries of first drafting, is that you might find that you hit something that you just have to change later. But that's a fact. We are going to hit things, and they are going to change later, because otherwise we'd all write the perfect story in the first draft. And I think what I'm hearing is that, you've got resistance because it's bogging you down. I've got resistance because I want to know the factual accuracy. But at the end of the day, it's just resistance. It's just something stopping us from advancing the words on the page. So I think in Stephen Pressfield's term, you just got to go, okay, well, that's resistance ring. He said, thank you. I understand what you're trying to do, but you're not getting me this time.
Right. Exactly. Just keep going.
Yeah.
Words to live by. Just keep going. Right. Do you have a craft question you would like discussed at the Storyworks Roundtable? Then we have an offer for you. Head over to iTunes specifically, and help us with our search rankings and discoverability by leaving a review. Within that review, pose your question. We will be going through these reviews, pulling out those questions, and in an upcoming episode, we're going to answer them all. We will have a Ask Us Anything Storyworks Roundtable episode in the not too distant future. So head over to iTunes, leave us a review, and pose your question. We can't wait to discuss your most pressing craft concerns. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.